The titanium wrench felt ancient in her calloused hands, its surface worn smooth by decades of use in her grandfather's basement workshop. Around her, the most advanced military engineers in the country stared at what looked like museum pieces scattered across her makeshift workstation. Vacuum tubes from the 1940s. Analog circuits that predated the moon landing. Components so old that half the room had never seen them outside of textbooks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The project director's assistant had already started taking photos, probably for some internal presentation about outdated contractor practices. 3 generals and a roomful of MIT graduates were watching a 28-year-old woman with grease under her fingernails arrange what appeared to be technological fossils into something that defied every principle of modern warfare. But Elena Rodriguez knew something they didn't. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the ones no one sees coming. Sometimes the best way to outsmart the future is to remember the past. And sometimes, when everyone is looking for complexity, the answer lies in beautiful, terrifying simplicity. What happened next would make the Pentagon rewrite their entire approach to weapons development. But before we show you how Elena turned forgotten technology into something that made 4-star generals take notes, let's go back to where it all began. Elena Rodriguez had learned to be invisible in plain sight long before she ever set foot in the Holloman Defense Research Facility. Growing up as the only daughter of a small-town auto mechanic in Roswell, New Mexico, she'd mastered the art of existing in spaces where women weren't expected to belong. While other kids her age were worried about prom dates and college applications, Elena was rebuilding transmission systems and rewiring electrical harnesses in her father's garage. The facility's morning briefing room buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that came from bringing together the brightest minds in military technology. Engineers from Lockheed Martin compared notes with DARPA researchers. MIT graduates exchanged theories with seasoned veterans who'd been building weapon systems since before Elena was born. Everyone had arrived at Holloman for the same reason: Project Blackout, the military's most ambitious attempt to develop next-generation electronic warfare capabilities. Elena occupied a corner table near the back, her battered laptop looking pathetic next to the sleek Surface tablets and military-grade hardware that surrounded her. Her contractor badge marked her as Rodriguez E. Independent Systems Analysis, a deliberately vague title that revealed nothing about her actual expertise. She preferred it that way. Anonymity was a weapon she'd learned to wield with precision. The morning's roster included presentations from defense giants, whose annual budgets exceeded the GDP of small countries. Raytheon was unveiling their latest signal jamming arrays. Boeing had brought prototypes that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies. Every presentation featured the same elements: cutting-edge processors, satellite integration, artificial intelligence algorithms that could adapt to enemy countermeasures in real time. Elena watched it all with the detached interest of someone who'd seen this pattern before. More complexity, more computational power, more features layered onto systems that were already struggling under their own sophistication. She'd spent the last 6 months studying the classified reports that detailed how these advanced systems performed in actual combat situations. The results weren't encouraging. Her own presentation wasn't scheduled until the afternoon, buried in the agenda between lunch and a coffee break. Alternative approaches to electronic warfare sounded academic and harmless, exactly how she'd designed it. The project coordinators had probably assumed she'd deliver some theoretical discussion about signal processing or frequency analysis. They had no idea what she was actually planning to show them. The morning dragged on with demonstration after demonstration of impressive technology that shared a common vulnerability. They all relied on the same fundamental assumptions about how electronic warfare should work: digital processing, encrypted communications, adaptive algorithms that could learn and respond to enemy tactics. It was brilliant engineering that had one fatal flaw. It was exactly what everyone expected. Elena's grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, had taught her that the most dangerous opponent in any conflict was the one who fought by different rules. Miguel had served as a radar technician in Vietnam, working with equipment that modern engineers would consider laughably primitive. But those primitive systems had advantages that their sophisticated descendants had sacrificed in pursuit of capability. They were simple, reliable, and completely unpredictable to enemies who'd spent decades learning to counter advanced technology. While the morning's presenters talked about teraflops and quantum encryption, Elena quietly organized her own materials. The cardboard boxes she'd shipped to Holloman contained components that most people would recognize from antique electronics stores. Vacuum tubes manufactured in the 1950s. Analog circuits designed when computers filled entire buildings. Mechanical switches and relay systems that operated without a single line of code. Her father had taught her to see beauty in mechanical solutions, to appreciate the elegant simplicity of systems that accomplished their purpose through physics rather than programming. Her grandfather had shown her how those same principles could be weaponized, how understanding the fundamentals of electromagnetic warfare could reveal opportunities that escaped more sophisticated minds. The combination of their knowledge had led Elena down a path that seemed to run counter to every trend in modern technology. While the world embraced digital solutions, she'd become an expert in analog systems. While others pursued complexity, she discovered power in simplicity. While everyone else was building systems that could be hacked, spoofed, or countered by equally advanced technology, Elena had been developing something that operated by rules so old that most people had forgotten they existed. Dr. Harrison Webb, the project director, represented everything Elena had learned to navigate around. Brilliant, accomplished, and absolutely convinced that technological superiority came from pushing the boundaries of what was possible. He'd earned his reputation developing systems that were undeniably impressive, but Elena had studied the classified after-action reports. She knew how often those impressive systems failed when faced with unexpected challenges. Webb commanded the room with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any discussion. His presentations were polished performances that combined genuine expertise with just enough condescension to remind everyone of the hierarchy. Elena had watched him dismiss ideas from contractors whose only crime was thinking differently about established problems. The morning's final presentation came from Webb himself, showcasing the current state-of-the-art in electronic warfare systems. The technology was genuinely impressive. Adaptive algorithms that could identify and counter enemy signals in milliseconds. Processing power that could handle thousands of simultaneous threats, integration with satellite networks that provided real-time battlefield awareness across entire continents. But Elena saw the weakness that everyone else missed. The system's greatest strength was also its most exploitable vulnerability. Its sophistication required it to make assumptions about what it would encounter. It was designed to fight enemies who played by the same rules, who used similar technology, who approached electronic warfare with the same fundamental assumptions about how modern conflicts should be fought. What would happen, Elena wondered, if someone ignored those rules entirely? What if an opponent used technology so simple, so fundamentally different, that the advanced systems couldn't even recognize it as a threat? What if the answer to defeating the most sophisticated electronic warfare systems in the world was to attack them with technology that predated their entire design philosophy? Elena had spent 2 years developing and testing that exact approach. Her grandfather's basement had become a laboratory where 1950s technology was being transformed into something that could potentially neutralize weapons systems worth billions of dollars. The irony wasn't lost on her. The future of warfare might depend on remembering its past. The morning sessions concluded with polite applause and networking conversations that Elena observed from her peripheral position. She wasn't part of the inner circle, didn't have the connections or credentials that opened doors to the real discussions where decisions were made, but she had something more valuable, an approach that no one else was considering, and the technical knowledge to make it work. As the room began to empty for lunch, Elena remained at her corner table, methodically reviewing her notes one final time. In 3 hours, she would have 30 minutes to convince some of the most experienced military engineers in the country that everything they believed about electronic warfare was wrong. She would need to demonstrate that obsolete technology could outperform their most advanced systems, that simplicity could triumph over sophistication, that the key to winning future conflicts might be found in the forgotten principles of past ones. The presentation would either establish her as a serious innovator or confirm her status as an irrelevant contractor with outdated ideas. But Elena had learned from her grandfather that the most decisive battles were often won by those who understood that victory sometimes required fighting by rules that everyone else had forgotten. The afternoon session began with a demonstration that would have been impressive if Elena hadn't already identified its fundamental weakness. Dr. Marcus Chen from Northrop Grumman wheeled in a device that resembled a futuristic sculpture more than military equipment. Sleek carbon fiber housing concealed processing units that cost more than most people's houses, and the integrated display showed real-time analysis of every electromagnetic signal within a 5-mile radius. The Neural Adaptive Defense System represents 15 years of development and $200 million in research, Chen announced with the pride of someone unveiling humanity's next evolutionary step. It learns from every encounter, building a database of enemy tactics that allows it to predict and counter new threats before they can cause damage. Elena watched the demonstration with growing fascination, not because of what the system could do, but because of what it couldn't see coming. The NADs operated by analyzing digital signatures, identifying patterns in how modern electronic warfare systems communicated and coordinated their attacks. It was brilliant at defeating sophisticated enemies who used equally sophisticated tools. But Elena's approach didn't rely on digital signatures. Her system operated in the analog realm, using electromagnetic principles that predated the digital revolution by decades. To the NADs, her technology would be invisible not because it was stealthy, but because it spoke a language the advanced system had never been programmed to understand. The demonstration continued, with Chen showing how the NADs could identify and neutralize simulated attacks from various adversaries. Chinese jammers were detected and countered within seconds. Russian signal interception attempts were blocked before they could acquire meaningful data. Iranian drone control frequencies were isolated and disabled with surgical precision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The beauty of machine learning, Chen explained, is that the system becomes more effective with every engagement. Each enemy tactic adds to our database, making us stronger and more prepared for future conflicts. Elena recognized the seductive logic of that approach. It was the same thinking that had driven military technology for the past 3 decades. If you could process information faster than your enemy, if you could outcompute them, you would inevitably win. The assumption was that future wars would be fought between increasingly sophisticated systems, each trying to outthink the other through superior algorithms and processing power. But what happened when someone chose not to play that game at all? During the coffee break that followed Chen's presentation, Elena found herself standing near a group of military advisors who were discussing the morning's demonstrations. Colonel Janet Torres, a career intelligence officer with 3 decades of experience, was expressing reservations that echoed Elena's own observations. "These systems are impressive," Torres said, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision, "but they all share the same vulnerability. They're designed to fight enemies who think like us, who approach electronic warfare with the same assumptions we do. What happens when we face an adversary who doesn't follow our playbook?" Major Kevin Sullivan, a younger officer who'd built his reputation on advanced systems integration, dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "With respect, ma'am, there's only so many ways to jam a signal or intercept communications. The physics are the physics. These systems are designed to handle every possible approach." Elena found herself moving closer to the conversation, drawn by Torres's insight. The colonel had identified exactly the gap that Elena's work was designed to exploit. Modern electronic warfare assumed that enemies would use modern tools, would approach problems with contemporary solutions, would fight according to rules that everyone understood. "Every possible approach we've thought of," Torres replied. "But military history is full of examples where the game changed because someone found a completely different way to approach the problem. The German Blitzkrieg worked because it broke the established rules of how wars were supposed to be fought. Asymmetric warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan succeeded because insurgents didn't fight like conventional armies." Quote, Elena recognized the moment for what it was, an opening. Torres understood the limitation that everyone else was overlooking. If Elena was going to find an ally in this room full of skeptics, it would be someone who appreciated that innovation often came from abandoning established approaches entirely. "Excuse me," Elena said, approaching the group with the careful confidence her father had taught her. "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion. Colonel Torres, you mentioned asymmetric approaches. Have you considered that electronic warfare might be vulnerable to the same kind of thinking?" Sullivan looked at Elena with the barely concealed condescension reserved for contractors who overstepped their boundaries. "I'm sorry, you are?" "Elena Rodriguez, Independent Systems Analysis," she replied, offering her hand. I'm presenting later this afternoon on alternative approaches to electronic warfare. Torres studied Elena with the evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to separating substance from noise. What kind of alternatives? Elena chose her words carefully. She needed to spark interest without revealing too much, to demonstrate insight without exposing her hand. Consider the assumptions that all these advanced systems make. They expect to encounter digital communications, encrypted signals, processing delays measured in microseconds. They're designed to outthink systems that operate according to familiar principles. And you think there's a different approach? Torres asked. I think there are approaches so different that modern systems wouldn't recognize them as threats until it was too late, Elena replied. Electronic warfare started long before digital processing existed. Some of those older principles might be more relevant than we realize. Sullivan scoffed. You're talking about vacuum tubes and mechanical switches. That technology is obsolete for a reason. Modern systems can do everything those old approaches could do, but faster and more efficiently. Elena felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came when someone walked directly into her area of expertise. Faster and more efficiently, yes, but also more predictably. Modern systems are sophisticated precisely because they follow sophisticated rules. What happens when someone ignores those rules entirely? Before Sullivan could respond, Dr. Webb approached the group. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic, reminding everyone of the hierarchy that governed these discussions. Ms. Rodriguez, isn't it? I believe you're scheduled to present after Dr. Patel from Lockheed Martin. Looking forward to seeing what you've prepared. Elena detected the subtle dismissal in Webb's tone, the polite skepticism reserved for presentations that weren't expected to contribute anything meaningful to serious discussions. Thank you, Dr. Webb. I think you'll find it interesting. I'm sure we will, Webb replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's always valuable to explore historical perspectives on contemporary problems. As Webb moved on to other conversations, Torres lingered. Ms. Rodriguez, you mentioned that older approaches might be more relevant than we realize. Care to elaborate? Elena glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Colonel, what would happen if someone attacked our most advanced electronic warfare systems using technology that predated their entire design philosophy? Technology so simple that these sophisticated algorithms couldn't even recognize it as a threat? Torres's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine attention. You're talking about something specific, aren't you? I'm talking about the possibility that the best way to defeat 21st century electronic warfare might be to attack it with 20th century principles, Elena replied. Or even 19th century principles, applied with modern understanding. That's an interesting theory, Torres said. Do you have any practical evidence to support it? Elena felt the weight of the cardboard boxes waiting in her hotel room, filled with components that could either validate her approach or expose her as a delusional contractor with outdated ideas. I have a working demonstration, Colonel, something that might change how we think about electronic warfare entirely. The conversation was interrupted by the afternoon session's opening announcement. As the group dispersed, Torres handed Elena her business card. Ms. Rodriguez, I'll be very interested in your presentation. If your approach has merit, there are people who need to hear about it. Elena pocketed the card, recognizing it as both an opportunity and a responsibility. Torres represented the kind of operational experience that could translate theoretical innovation into practical applications. But earning that support would require more than theoretical discussions and compelling arguments. She would need to prove that obsolete technology could outperform the most advanced systems in the room. She would need to demonstrate that simplicity could triumph over sophistication, that the future of electronic warfare might depend on remembering its past. Most importantly, she would need to show a room full of skeptics that everything they believed about technological superiority was wrong. The afternoon's first presentation began with Dr. Priya Patel from Lockheed Martin unveiling their latest signal processing algorithms. The technology was undeniably impressive, capable of analyzing and countering electronic threats with speed and precision that bordered on the supernatural. But Elena saw it differently now, recognizing the sophisticated system as a precisely engineered trap that was waiting for the right kind of bait. Her grandfather had taught her that the most effective attacks often came from directions that defenders never considered. He'd told her stories about radar operators in Vietnam who'd been defeated not by superior technology but by enemies who understood that sometimes the best way to hide was to become invisible by being obviously present. Elena's approach operated on similar principles. Instead of trying to outcompete advanced electronic warfare systems on their own terms, she had developed something that attacked them from a direction they couldn't defend against because they didn't even know it existed. As Patel's presentation concluded to appreciative applause, Elena realized that her moment was approaching. In less than an hour, she would have 30 minutes to convince some of the most experienced military engineers in the country that their fundamental assumptions about electronic warfare were wrong. She would need to prove that obsolete equipment could be transformed into something capable of neutralizing systems worth billions of dollars. The presentation would establish her credibility or destroy it entirely. But Elena had learned from her grandfather that the most important battles were often won by those who understood that victory sometimes required fighting by rules that everyone else had forgotten. Today, she would find out if that lesson still held true in the age of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Elena's hands moved with practiced precision as she arranged her equipment on the presentation table, each component placed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that first impressions could determine whether people listened or dismissed her entirely. The vacuum tubes caught the fluorescent lighting like amber jewels, their glass surfaces reflecting decades of technological evolution that most people in the room had never witnessed firsthand. Dr. Rajesh Patel from MIT leaned forward in his seat, squinting at the collection of components with the fascination of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. "Are those actual 6L6 power tubes?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of nostalgia and bewilderment. "I haven't seen those since my undergraduate electronics lab in the 80s. Elena nodded, connecting a thick cable between two devices that looked like they belonged in a museum. 1952 manufacturing date on most of them, still in their original packaging until last month. The comment drew scattered chuckles from around the room, the kind of polite laughter reserved for presentations that weren't expected to contribute meaningfully to serious discussions. Elena had anticipated the reaction. To these engineers, her equipment looked like a collection of technological curiosities rather than tools capable of revolutionizing electronic warfare. Dr. Webb checked his watch with the subtle impatience of someone managing a tight schedule. "Ms. Rodriguez, I believe you have 30 minutes allocated for your presentation. Please proceed when you're ready." Elena straightened, surveying the room with the calm assessment her grandfather had taught her. 43 people, representing some of the most advanced military technology programs in the world. Defense contractors whose annual budgets exceeded the GDP of small nations. Military advisors who'd spent decades developing strategies for conflicts that might determine the future of warfare itself. And every single one of them was about to discover that their fundamental assumptions about electronic warfare were completely wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, her voice carrying across the room with the quiet authority her father had demonstrated when explaining complex mechanical problems to skeptical customers. "For the past 6 hours, you've seen demonstrations of the most advanced electronic warfare systems ever developed. Artificial intelligence algorithms that learn from every encounter. Processing power that can analyze thousands of simultaneous threats. Integration with satellite networks that provide real-time battlefield awareness across entire continents." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "These systems represent billions of dollars in research and development. They can defeat any known electronic warfare technology currently deployed by potential adversaries. They are, by every measurable standard, the most sophisticated defensive systems in human history." Dr. Chen shifted in his seat, uncertain whether Elena was building toward a compliment or a criticism. Colonel Torres watched with the focused attention of someone who sensed that something significant was about to unfold. "But they all share a single, catastrophic vulnerability," Elena continued, her tone shifting from appreciation to analysis. "They were designed to fight enemies who approach electronic warfare with the same fundamental assumptions that guided their development. They expect to encounter digital communications, encrypted signals, processing delays measured in microseconds. They are optimized to defeat sophisticated opponents who use sophisticated tools." Elena gestured toward her collection of vintage components. "What happens when someone chooses not to play by those rules? What happens when an adversary uses technology so fundamentally different that these advanced systems can't even recognize it as a threat?" Major Sullivan couldn't contain his skepticism any longer. "Ms. Rodriguez, with respect, those components represent technology that was obsolete before most of us were born. Modern systems can do everything vacuum tubes could do, but exponentially faster and more efficiently." Elena had been waiting for exactly that objection. "Major Sullivan, you're absolutely correct. Modern systems are faster, more efficient, and vastly more capable than anything from the 1950s. But they're also more predictable. They operate according to principles that enemy systems have been designed to counter. They communicate using protocols that adversaries have spent decades learning to intercept and decode. She picked up one of the vacuum tubes, holding it up to catch the light. This technology communicates using electromagnetic principles that predate the digital revolution entirely. It operates in frequency ranges that modern systems monitor but don't actively defend against. Most importantly, it uses analog signals that can't be decoded or countered using digital processing techniques. Dr. Patel leaned forward with growing interest. You're suggesting that obsolete technology could penetrate modern defenses precisely because it's too primitive for those defenses to recognize? I'm suggesting that the most effective way to defeat 21st century electronic warfare systems might be to attack them with 20th century principles, Elena replied. Consider stealth aircraft technology. The F-117 wasn't invisible to radar because it used advanced materials. It was invisible because its angular design reflected radar signals in directions that conventional systems weren't monitoring. The room had grown quieter, with conversations dying out as people began to grasp the implications of Elena's argument. Even Webb was watching with something approaching genuine attention. Elena continued, her confidence building as she saw her audience beginning to understand. My grandfather served as a radar technician in Vietnam. He told me stories about American technology being defeated not by superior systems, but by enemies who understood that sometimes the best way to hide was to become invisible by being completely unexpected. She began connecting cables between her various components, the mechanical clicks of analog switches providing a sharp contrast to the silent digital interfaces everyone else had been using. Electronic warfare started with vacuum tubes and mechanical relays. Those systems had limitations, certainly, but they also had advantages that modern technology has sacrificed in pursuit of capability. What kind of advantages? Torres asked, her operational experience allowing her to see implications that the pure engineers might miss. Elena powered up her first device, and the vacuum tubes began to glow with the warm, amber light that had once illuminated countless electronics before the Silicon Revolution. Immunity to electromagnetic pulse, for one. These tubes will continue operating after an EMP event that would destroy every piece of digital technology in this room. They're also immune to cyber attacks because they don't run software that can be compromised. She activated a second device, and the room filled with a low humming sound that seemed to resonate in everyone's chest. But most importantly, they operate using electromagnetic principles that modern defensive systems don't actively counter because they're not designed to encounter them. Dr. Chen was studying Elena's setup with the focused attention of someone beginning to understand that he might be witnessing something significant. You're claiming that this equipment can penetrate the NA-DAS system we demonstrated this morning? Elena met his gaze directly. Dr. Chen, I'm claiming that your $200 million system can't even detect what I'm about to show you, much less defend against it. Your algorithms are looking for digital signatures, encrypted communications, and processing patterns that simply don't exist in analog systems. The silence that followed wasn't skeptical anymore. It was the kind of focused attention reserved for moments when people realized they might be about to learn something that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew. Webb stood up slowly, his expression shifting from polite tolerance to genuine concern. Ms. Rodriguez, are you suggesting that you can demonstrate a successful attack against the most advanced electronic warfare defense system currently in development? Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came when everything she'd worked toward condensed into a single moment of truth. Her grandfather had taught her that the most important battles were often won by those who understood that victory sometimes required fighting by rules that everyone else had forgotten. Her father had shown her that the most elegant solutions often appeared simple only because they were based on principles so fundamental that people stopped paying attention to them. Dr. Webb, Elena replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from months of preparation and years of accumulated knowledge. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm offering to prove it. She gestured toward her collection of vintage equipment, now humming and glowing with the distinctive characteristics of analog electronics. Give me 30 minutes with your NA-DAS system, and I'll show you exactly how vulnerable your most advanced defenses really are. The challenge hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Elena had just offered to demonstrate that everything the room's experts believed about electronic warfare superiority was wrong. She'd claimed that obsolete technology could neutralize systems that represented the pinnacle of military engineering achievement. More importantly, she'd made that claim in front of witnesses who had the authority to either validate her approach or ensure that she never worked on another defense project again. The next few minutes would determine whether Elena Rodriguez was a visionary innovator or a delusional contractor with dangerous ideas about technological warfare. But Elena had learned from her grandfather that the most decisive moments often required people to choose between safety and truth. Today, she was betting everything on the possibility that truth was more powerful than the accumulated assumptions of an entire generation of military engineers. The room waited for Dr. Webb's response, and Elena prepared to discover whether her understanding of electromagnetic warfare was about to revolutionize military technology or destroy her career entirely. Dr. Webb's expression had transformed from polite skepticism to something approaching alarm. The implications of Elena's challenge were becoming clear to everyone in the room. If she could demonstrate that obsolete technology could penetrate the most advanced defensive system in development, it would invalidate years of research and billions of dollars in investment. Ms. Rodriguez, Webb said carefully, "You understand that the NADES system is classified technology. Any demonstration would need to be conducted under controlled conditions with appropriate security protocols." Elena had anticipated this response. "Of course, Dr. Webb. I'm not asking to examine your system's internal operations or access any classified information. I'm simply requesting permission to attempt a penetration test using my equipment. Your team can monitor everything I do and stop the demonstration at any point." Colonel Torres stood up, her operational experience allowing her to see the strategic value of Elena's proposal. "Dr. Webb, if Ms. Rodriguez's approach has merit, we need to understand its implications immediately. If it doesn't work, we've lost nothing but 30 minutes. If it does work, we've identified a critical vulnerability that needs to be addressed." The room buzzed with whispered conversations as engineers and military advisors processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't a theoretical discussion anymore. Elena had offered to provide empirical proof that the fundamental assumptions underlying modern electronic warfare were wrong. Dr. Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The NADES system represented his life's work, 15 years of development that had culminated in what he believed was an unassailable defensive capability. "Dr. Webb, the system is designed to counter every known approach to electronic warfare. The algorithms have been tested against thousands of different attack scenarios." "But not against this approach," Elena interjected quietly. "Your tests were based on digital attacks, on enemies who would use contemporary technology to achieve their objectives. You never tested against someone who chose to ignore the digital revolution entirely." Elena began making final adjustments to her equipment, the mechanical clicks of analog switches providing a stark contrast to the digital silence that characterized modern technology. "Dr. Chen, your system is brilliant at defeating sophisticated opponents, but what happens when the opponent isn't sophisticated? What happens when they're using technology so primitive that your algorithms don't even recognize it as a threat?" Dr. Sarah Martinez from Raytheon leaned forward with growing concern. "Are you suggesting that our entire approach to electronic warfare defense is fundamentally flawed?" Elena looked up from her equipment, meeting Martinez's gaze directly. "I'm suggesting that your approach is optimized for a specific type of threat. You've built the perfect defense against enemies who fight using rules that you understand. But those rules aren't universal laws of physics. They're conventions that developed because everyone agreed to use similar technology." She powered up another device, and the distinctive whine of high-voltage analog circuits filled the room. Electronic warfare existed long before digital processing. The principles I'm using were developed when vacuum tubes were cutting-edge technology. They work according to electromagnetic laws that haven't changed since Maxwell published his equations in the 1860s. Major Sullivan was studying Elena's setup with the reluctant fascination of someone beginning to understand that his worldview might be incomplete. Even if your technology can generate signals that modern systems don't expect, what makes you think it can actually cause damage? These aren't the simple radio systems of the 1950s. Quote. Elena smiled, recognizing the question as an opportunity to demonstrate the depth of her preparation. "Major, you're thinking about this wrong. I'm not trying to match the capability of modern systems. I'm trying to exploit their dependencies. Every advanced electronic warfare system relies on certain assumptions about how electromagnetic signals will behave. When those assumptions are wrong, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Dr. Webb made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Very well, Ms. Rodriguez. We'll conduct your demonstration, but under controlled conditions, with full monitoring, and with my authority to terminate the test if necessary." Elena felt her heart rate spike, but her voice remained steady. "Thank you, Dr. Webb. You won't regret this decision." The next 20 minutes were spent establishing the test parameters. Elena's equipment would be positioned 50 meters from the NADS system, with electromagnetic monitoring devices recording every signal generated during the demonstration. Dr. Chen's team would operate their system in full defensive mode, actively scanning for and countering any detected threats. "The beauty of this arrangement," Elena explained as technicians positioned monitoring equipment, "is that we'll have complete documentation of everything that happens. Your instruments will record every electromagnetic signal I generate, and will be able to analyze exactly how your system responds." Dr. Chen was making final adjustments to the NADS interface, his confidence gradually returning as he confirmed that all defensive algorithms were operating at peak efficiency. "Ms. Rodriguez, I want to be clear about what you're attempting. The NADS system monitors the entire electromagnetic spectrum continuously. It can detect and counter signals that last for microseconds. If your equipment generates any kind of electromagnetic emission, we'll see it immediately." Elena nodded approvingly. "Dr. Chen, I'm counting on your system working exactly as designed. In fact, the more sophisticated your detection capabilities, the more effective my demonstration will be." Colonel Torres positioned herself where she could observe both Elena's equipment and the NADS monitoring displays. Her military experience had taught her to watch for details that engineers might miss, to look for implications that extended beyond immediate technical performance. "Ms. Rodriguez," Torres said, "assuming your demonstration succeeds, what are the broader implications? How would this change our approach to electronic warfare?" Elena paused in her final equipment checks, considering the question carefully. "Colonel, if I'm right about this, it means that our entire strategy for electronic warfare superiority needs to be reconsidered. We've been building increasingly sophisticated systems to fight enemies who might choose to use increasingly primitive ones. It's like preparing for a chess match against an opponent who decides to play checkers instead." Dr. Martinez was taking notes, already thinking about how Elena's approach might apply to her own programs. But surely there are limitations to analog systems. They can't match the capability, the precision, the adaptability of digital technology. "You're absolutely right," Elena agreed. "Analog systems are limited in many ways. They can't process information as quickly, they can't adapt to new situations automatically, they can't integrate with modern command and control networks, but they have one crucial advantage. They're completely unexpected." Elena stepped back from her equipment, the final connections completed. Banks of vacuum tubes glowed with warm amber light, mechanical relays clicked in rhythmic patterns, and analog meters displayed electromagnetic field strengths using technology that predated the integrated circuit by decades. "Dr. Webb," Elena announced, "I'm ready to begin the demonstration." The room fell silent, except for the humming of Elena's equipment and the nearly inaudible whisper of the NADS system's cooling fans. 43 people watched as a 28-year-old contractor prepared to challenge the fundamental assumptions that had guided military technology development for an entire generation. Elena's grandfather had taught her that the most important battles were often won by those who understood that victory sometimes required fighting by rules that everyone else had forgotten. Her father had shown her that the most elegant solutions often appeared simple only because they were based on principles so fundamental that people stopped paying attention to them. Now she was about to discover whether those lessons could be applied to the most advanced military technology on Earth. "NADS system is operational," Dr. Chen announced, his voice carrying across the room with professional precision. "All defensive algorithms active, full spectrum monitoring engaged. We're ready to detect and counter any electromagnetic threat." Elena placed her hand on the master control switch, a heavy mechanical device that had been manufactured before computers existed. Around her, digital displays showed real-time analysis of the electromagnetic environment, processing capabilities that would have seemed like magic to the engineers who designed her equipment. But magic, Elena had learned, was often just science that people didn't understand yet. And sometimes the oldest science was the most powerful precisely because it was the most unexpected. Beginning electromagnetic warfare demonstration, Elena announced, using technology designed in 1952 against defensive systems designed in 2024. She threw the switch, and $50 million worth of monitoring equipment immediately registered the most unusual electromagnetic signature any of them had ever seen. But as Elena watched the NAD's displays, she smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose months of preparation were about to be validated. The most advanced electronic warfare defense system in human history was scanning desperately for threats it had been designed to counter. But Elena's signals were speaking a language that the NADs had never learned to understand, operating according to principles that predated its entire design philosophy. The real demonstration was just beginning. The electromagnetic spectrum erupted with signals that shouldn't have existed. Elena's vintage equipment was broadcasting on frequencies that military engineers had relegated to historical footnotes, using modulation techniques that predated the Cold War, generating waveforms that looked like archaeological artifacts on the monitoring displays. Dr. Chen stared at his NADS interface with growing confusion. The system's artificial intelligence was processing thousands of data points per second, analyzing every electromagnetic emission within its operational range. But something was wrong. The algorithms were detecting signals, cataloging their characteristics, comparing them against threat databases that contained every known electronic warfare technique developed over the past 4 decades. And finding nothing. System status? Dr. Webb asked, his voice tight with concern. All algorithms operating normally, Chen replied, his fingers dancing across the interface as he verified system integrity. Full spectrum monitoring active, threat analysis running continuously. But the AI isn't classifying any of Rodriguez's signals as threats requiring countermeasures. Elena monitored her own equipment with the calm satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as predicted. The vacuum tubes were operating in their optimal range. Mechanical relays were switching in patterns that created electromagnetic pulses designed according to principles that Werner von Braun would have recognized. Her analog oscilloscope displayed waveforms that looked primitive compared to the sophisticated digital signals everyone else was accustomed to seeing. But primitive didn't mean ineffective. Dr. Chen, Elena called out, can you tell me what threat level your system has assigned to my transmissions? Chen checked his displays again, scrolling through diagnostic screens that showed every detail of the NADS system's current operations. The system registers your signals as background electromagnetic noise, low priority, no threat classification, no countermeasures initiated. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. $50 million worth of monitoring equipment, algorithms trained on decades of electronic warfare data, artificial intelligence systems that could detect and counter the most sophisticated attacks ever conceived, and Elena's equipment was being dismissed as irrelevant background noise. Colonel Torres stepped closer to the monitoring station, studying the displays with the focused attention of someone who understood that she might be witnessing a fundamental shift in military technology. Ms. Rodriguez, your signals are clearly visible on our instruments. Why isn't the NAD system recognizing them as threats? Elena adjusted a mechanical dial on her primary transmitter, the analog meter showing increased electromagnetic field strength. Colonel, the NAD system is working exactly as designed. It's looking for digital signatures, encrypted communications, frequency hopping patterns, processing delays that indicate computer-controlled systems. My equipment doesn't generate any of those characteristics. She gestured toward her collection of vintage components. These signals are being generated by vacuum tubes and mechanical relays. There's no digital processing, no encryption, no computer control whatsoever. To the NADS algorithms, they look like natural electromagnetic phenomena rather than deliberate electronic warfare attacks. Dr. Martinez was taking rapid notes, her engineering background allowing her to grasp the implications immediately. You're saying that the system's sophistication is actually working against it. The algorithms are too advanced to recognize primitive threats. Exactly, Elena confirmed. It's like training a chess grandmaster to recognize every possible strategic combination, then having them play against someone who moves their pieces randomly. The grandmaster keeps looking for sophisticated tactics that simply aren't there. Elena reached for a second control panel, this one containing switches and dials that looked like they belonged in a 1950s laboratory. Dr. Chen, I want you to watch your signal analysis display very carefully. I'm about to demonstrate what happens when analog technology targets the assumptions built into digital systems. She began adjusting frequency generators that operated without any computer control, creating electromagnetic patterns that followed mathematical relationships discovered by Heinrich Hertz in the late 1800s. The signals were simple by modern standards, lacking the complexity that characterized contemporary electronic warfare. But simplicity, Elena had learned, could be its own form of sophistication. The monitoring equipment registered immediate changes in the electromagnetic environment. New signals appeared on spectrum analyzers, their characteristics unlike anything the military engineers had seen in operational contexts. The waveforms were clean, symmetrical, following patterns that seemed almost organic compared to the jagged complexity of digital communications. But the NADS system continued to classify them as non-threatening background emissions. Phase 1 complete, Elena announced. My transmissions are now saturating multiple frequency bands that your system monitors but doesn't actively defend. The algorithms recognize these signals exist, but they're not triggering any defensive responses. Dr. Chen was studying his interface with growing concern. The NADS system was functioning perfectly according to every diagnostic parameter, but Elena's signals were passing through its defenses like they were invisible. This shouldn't be possible. The system is designed to counter any electromagnetic threat regardless of its technical characteristics. Elena smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Dr. Chen, your system is designed to counter threats that operate according to assumptions you understand. But what happens when someone ignores those assumptions entirely? She moved to her final control station, where mechanical switches controlled circuits that had been hand-built according to schematics from the Eisenhower administration. Phase 2 will demonstrate the actual vulnerability. Your system has been scanning for digital threats, looking for the electronic signatures that characterize modern weapon systems, but it's not prepared for what happens when someone uses those undefended frequency bands to deliver an analog attack. Elena's grandfather had taught her that electromagnetic warfare was fundamentally about energy transfer. Every electronic system, regardless of its sophistication, depended on stable electromagnetic fields to operate correctly. Disrupt those fields in the right way, and even the most advanced technology would fail. The key was understanding that disruption didn't require matching the target's technological sophistication. It only required delivering the right kind of electromagnetic energy at the right frequency with the right timing. And sometimes, the most effective way to do that was to use technology so simple that defenders never considered it a threat. Elena threw the final switch, and her equipment began generating what appeared to be random electromagnetic noise. The signals looked chaotic on the monitoring displays, lacking the structured patterns that characterize deliberate electronic warfare. But chaos, Elena knew, could be precisely engineered when you understood the underlying physics. For the first 30 seconds, nothing seemed to happen. The NADS system continued operating normally, its displays showing stable performance across all parameters. Dr. Chen began to relax, thinking that Elena's demonstration had reached its limits without causing any actual damage. Then, the first subsystem began experiencing intermittent errors. Signal processing module reporting anomalous behavior, Chen announced, his voice carrying the first hint of genuine concern. Random calculation errors, nothing that affects primary functions. Elena watched her analog meters with the focused attention of someone monitoring a carefully orchestrated symphony. The electromagnetic fields she was generating were interacting with the NADS electronics in ways that the system's designers had never anticipated. Not because the fields were particularly powerful, but because they were operating in frequency ranges that the digital systems had never been hardened against. More subsystems began reporting errors. Memory modules experienced data corruption. Processing units generated incorrect calculations. Communication links started dropping packets randomly. None of the individual failures were catastrophic, but their cumulative effect was creating system-wide instability. Dr. Chen, Elena called out, can you tell me what countermeasures your system is deploying against my attack? Chen was frantically checking diagnostic displays, trying to understand why his sophisticated defensive algorithms weren't responding to what was clearly an electronic assault. The system still doesn't recognize your transmissions as threats. It's not deploying any countermeasures because it doesn't understand that it's under attack. The room watched in stunned silence as the most advanced electronic warfare defense system in development began failing victim to technology that belonged in a museum. Error messages cascaded across displays that had never shown anything but perfect performance. Backup systems activated automatically, then began experiencing their own problems as Elena's analog signals continued their relentless electromagnetic assault. Dr. Webb stepped forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm. "Ms. Rodriguez, what exactly are you doing to our system?" Elena made final adjustments to her equipment, fine-tuning the electromagnetic fields with the precision of someone who understood exactly how analog energy could disrupt digital processing. "Dr. Webb, I'm demonstrating that your $200 million defensive system can be neutralized by equipment that cost less than $5,000 to build." She gestured toward the NADS monitoring station, where error messages were appearing faster than Dr. Chen could acknowledge them. "Your system is failing because it was designed to fight sophisticated enemies who would use sophisticated tools. It never occurred to your engineers that someone might attack using technology so primitive that your defenses couldn't even recognize it as a weapon." The demonstration continued for another 10 minutes, with Elena systematically targeting different aspects of the NADS system using analog techniques that exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in digital electronics. She showed how vacuum tube oscillators could generate electromagnetic interference that caused memory corruption. She demonstrated how mechanical relay systems could create timing disruptions that cascaded through processing networks. She proved that analog signals could exploit the electromagnetic assumptions built into every advanced electronic system. By the time Elena powered down her equipment, the NADS system was experiencing system-wide failures that would require complete reinitialization to resolve. $200 million in research and development had been neutralized by technology that seemed to belong in a different century entirely. The silence that followed wasn't just about technical appreciation. It was the quiet that came when people realized they had witnessed something that would change their understanding of electronic warfare forever. Elena had proven that the most advanced military technology could be defeated not by superior sophistication, but by approaches so fundamentally different that existing defenses couldn't even recognize them as threats. Dr. Webb stared at the failed NADS displays, then turned to Elena with an expression that mixed respect with genuine concern. "Ms. Rodriguez, what you've demonstrated here has implications that extend far beyond our current programs. If analog technology can neutralize our most advanced defensive systems, we need to completely reconsider our approach to electronic warfare." Elena began powering down her vintage equipment, the amber glow fading from vacuum tubes that had just redefined the future of military technology. "Dr. Webb, that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The silence in the room wasn't the polite quiet that followed academic presentations. It was the heavy stillness that came when intelligent people realized they had just witnessed something that would force them to question everything they thought they understood about their field. 43 of the most experienced military engineers in the country sat staring at displays showing the complete failure of systems they had considered unassailable. General Patricia Hawkins, who had been observing quietly from the back of the room, stepped forward with the measured pace of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. Her presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room, reminding everyone that Elena's demonstration had implications far beyond academic interest. "Ms. Rodriguez," General Hawkins said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in military technology development. "What you've shown us today represents either the most significant breakthrough in electronic warfare in the past 20 years or the most serious vulnerability we've ever encountered. Which is it?" Elena finished disconnecting her equipment cables, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. "General Hawkins, I believe it's both. The same principles that allowed me to neutralize the NADS system could be used defensively to protect our own systems against similar attacks." Dr. Chen was still staring at his failed displays, running diagnostic routines that confirmed what everyone had witnessed. The system is completely non-functional. Memory corruption, processing errors, communication failures across all subsystems. It will require complete reinitialization and potentially hardware replacement. General Hawkins turned to Dr. Webb with the expression of someone who needed immediate answers to questions that would affect strategic planning at the highest levels. "Dr. Webb, How long would it take to modify the NADS system to defend against this type of attack? Webb consulted his tablet, scrolling through technical specifications that had been rendered obsolete in the past hour. General, the system would need fundamental redesign. The algorithms are optimized for digital threat detection. Adding analog signal recognition would require new sensor arrays, modified processing architectures, and completely different threat identification protocols. Timeline? Hawkins asked curtly. 18 to 24 months for basic capability, assuming unlimited funding and priority development status, Webb replied. Full integration with existing systems could take 3 to 5 years. Elena had been listening to the exchange with growing realization of what her demonstration meant. She'd proven that American military technology had a fundamental vulnerability that would take years to address. But she'd also proven that the same vulnerability could be exploited to America's advantage if the approach was developed properly. General, Elena interjected, there's another consideration. If our adversaries develop similar capabilities, they could neutralize our most advanced systems using technology that costs less than a single cruise missile. The strategic implications extend far beyond the NADS program. Quote, Colonel Torres was taking rapid notes, her operational experience allowing her to see implications that pure engineers might miss. Ms. Rodriguez raises a critical point. If analog technology can defeat our electronic warfare defenses, what does that mean for our satellite communications, our drone operations, our entire C4I infrastructure? Dr. Martinez looked up from her own notes with obvious concern. We've spent 40 years developing increasingly sophisticated electronic systems based on the assumption that technological superiority would provide strategic advantage. If that assumption is wrong, we need to reconsider everything. General Hawkins studied Elena with the evaluating gaze of someone who specialized in identifying talent that could be useful to national security objectives. Ms. Rodriguez, what's your background in electronic warfare development? Elena felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated by people who held her future in their hands. General, my formal training is in electrical engineering and systems analysis, but my practical knowledge comes from 15 years of working with my grandfather, who served as a radar technician in Vietnam, and my father, who specialized in automotive electrical systems. Self-taught, then, Hawkins observed, which explains why you approach the problem differently than our formally trained specialists. Dr. Patel from MIT leaned forward with the excited expression of someone who'd just recognized the significance of what he'd witnessed. General, Ms. Rodriguez has identified a fundamental blind spot in our entire approach to electronic warfare. We've been so focused on staying ahead of sophisticated threats that we never considered primitive ones. Elena seized the opportunity to explain the broader implications of her work. The vulnerability exists because modern systems are designed to counter modern threats. But electronic warfare principles haven't changed since Maxwell published his equations. The physics that governed radio technology in the 1920s still apply today. She gestured toward her collection of vintage equipment. These components operate according to the same electromagnetic laws that govern your most advanced systems. The difference is that they use those laws in ways that modern defensive algorithms aren't programmed to recognize or counter. General Hawkins was already thinking about applications that extended beyond the immediate demonstration. Ms. Rodriguez, could this approach be scaled for battlefield deployment? Could we develop portable systems that could neutralize enemy electronic warfare capabilities? Elena had been anticipating that question for months. General, the principles scale very effectively. Portable analog systems could be deployed against enemy air defense networks, communication systems, or any electronic infrastructure that relies on digital processing. The key advantage is that they're immune to the countermeasures that adversaries have developed against our conventional electronic warfare tools. Dr. Webb was studying Elena with newfound respect, recognizing that she'd accomplished something his entire team had missed. Ms. Rodriguez, you mentioned defensive applications. Could analog technology protect our systems against similar attacks? Absolutely, Elena replied. Analog filtering systems could isolate critical electronics from electromagnetic interference. Hybrid architectures could combine digital processing with analog backup systems that would remain operational even if the primary systems were compromised. Colonel Torres was thinking about operational implications, scenarios where Elena's technology could provide tactical advantages that conventional systems couldn't match. Ms. Rodriguez, what would be required to develop this capability for field deployment? Elena had prepared detailed proposals for exactly this question. Colonel, the technology could be developed rapidly because the underlying principles are well understood. The challenge isn't inventing new science, it's applying old science in ways that modern enemies won't expect. General Hawkins exchanged meaningful glances with Colonel Torres and Dr. Webb, the kind of silent communication that occurred between people who'd worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. Elena recognized the moment for what it was. A decision point that would determine whether her demonstration led to genuine opportunities or remained an interesting academic exercise. Ms. Rodriguez, General Hawkins said formally, the Department of Defense has an immediate need for expertise in asymmetric electronic warfare capabilities. Would you be interested in discussing a consulting arrangement that would allow you to develop this technology under appropriate oversight? Elena felt her heart rate spike, but her voice remained steady. General, I would be very interested in that discussion. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly observing the conversation while running system diagnostics, finally spoke up. Ms. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. When I saw your equipment, I assumed you were presenting historical curiosities rather than functional technology. You've demonstrated capabilities that none of us anticipated. Elena accepted the apology with the grace her father had taught her. Dr. Chen, your system performed exactly as designed. The problem wasn't with your engineering. It was with the assumptions that guided the design requirements. General Hawkins was already moving toward practical next steps. Ms. Rodriguez, I want you to prepare a comprehensive briefing on your technology for presentation to the Joint Chiefs within 30 days. Colonel Torres will coordinate the security clearance process and provide you with the classification guidelines. Elena realized that her life was about to change in ways she'd never imagined. 3 hours ago, she'd been an unknown contractor presenting alternative approaches to military engineers who weren't expecting to learn anything significant. Now she was being asked to brief the highest levels of military leadership on technology that could reshape electronic warfare strategy. There's one more thing, General Hawkins added. This demonstration remains classified at the highest levels until we can assess its strategic implications. The vulnerability you've identified could be exploited by adversaries if they develop similar capabilities. Dr. Webb was thinking about research implications, opportunities to explore approaches that his team had never considered. Ms. Rodriguez, would you be willing to collaborate with our existing programs? Your perspective could help us identify other vulnerabilities we might have missed. Elena looked around the room at faces that had transformed from skepticism to respect over the course of a single afternoon. Military engineers who dismissed her equipment as obsolete were now asking for her expertise in developing technologies that could influence national security strategy. But Elena also understood that her demonstration had revealed something more significant than a technical vulnerability. She'd proven that innovation often came from approaching familiar problems with unfamiliar perspectives, that the most effective solutions sometimes required abandoning sophisticated approaches in favor of fundamental ones. Her grandfather had taught her that the most important battles were often won by those who understood that victory sometimes required fighting by rules that everyone else had forgotten. Today, she discovered that those lessons were more relevant than ever in an age of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The meeting concluded with Elena being assigned a security liaison, given preliminary classification briefings, and scheduled for follow-up sessions that would determine how her technology could be integrated into existing defense programs. But as the room began to empty, Elena realized that the most significant change wasn't in her professional prospects. She was no longer the invisible contractor who arranged obsolete equipment in the corner of briefing rooms. She had become someone whose ideas were taken seriously by people who made decisions affecting national security. More importantly, she had proven that sometimes the best way to solve tomorrow's problems was to remember yesterday's solutions. 6 months after Elena Rodriguez had walked into a military briefing room carrying cardboard boxes filled with obsolete equipment, she stood in the Pentagon's most secure conference facility, addressing a gathering that included the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and intelligence officials whose names would never appear in public records. The transformation seemed almost surreal, but the technology she developed had proven its strategic value in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic projections. The briefing room's displays showed real-world test results that validated every principle Elena had demonstrated at Holloman. Project Retrograde, as her program had been designated, had successfully neutralized advanced electronic warfare systems deployed by 3 different adversaries during classified operations. Chinese signal jamming equipment had been rendered inoperable by analog transmitters small enough to fit in a backpack. Russian cyber warfare infrastructure had been disrupted by electromagnetic pulses generated using vacuum tube technology from the Eisenhower era. Iranian drone control systems had lost communication with their aircraft when confronted by frequency generators that operated according to principles from Heinrich Hertz's original experiments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, her voice carrying across the room with confidence that had been forged through months of successful field demonstrations. "What we've learned over the past 6 months is that the electronic warfare landscape has been fundamentally transformed. Not because we've developed more sophisticated technology, but because we've remembered how to use principles that our adversaries have forgotten existed." Secretary of Defense Catherine Morrison leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose decisions affected global security strategy. "Ms. Rodriguez, your technology has achieved remarkable success in operational environments, but I need to understand the long-term implications. Are we looking at a temporary advantage that adversaries can counter, or have we identified a sustainable strategic capability?" Elena had been preparing for exactly this question. "Madam Secretary, the advantage is sustainable precisely because it doesn't depend on technological superiority in the conventional sense. Our adversaries can develop countermeasures against digital attacks because digital systems operate according to predictable algorithms, but analog systems operate according to physical laws that can't be reprogrammed or updated." General Michael Foster, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, studied the operational reports displayed on his tablet. "Ms. Rodriguez, these field results show success rates that exceed our most optimistic projections. But I'm concerned about scalability. Can this approach be deployed across multiple theaters simultaneously?" Elena gestured toward a series of photographs showing equipment that looked deceptively simple compared to the high-tech systems that surrounded it. "General Foster, one of the key advantages of analog technology is its manufacturing simplicity. These systems can be produced rapidly using components that are readily available and techniques that don't require specialized facilities." She advanced to the next slide, showing production timelines that had astonished defense contractors accustomed to multi-year development cycles. "We can deploy operational systems in weeks rather than years. The technology doesn't require the rare earth elements that constrain advanced electronics production, and it can be manufactured using machine tools that existed in the 1950s. Quote, "Admiral Sarah Chin, Chief of Naval Operations, was thinking about implications for maritime operations where electronic warfare capabilities could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Ms. Rodriguez, how does this technology perform in contested electromagnetic environments? Our naval assets operate in situations where multiple adversaries are actively jamming communications and sensor systems." Elena smiled, recognizing the question as an opportunity to demonstrate one of her technology's most significant advantages. "Admiral Chen, analog systems actually perform better in contested environments than digital ones. Electronic jamming is designed to disrupt digital communications by introducing noise into data streams. But analog systems can be designed to operate using that same noise as a power source." The room buzzed with whispered conversations as military leaders processed the implications of Elena's statement. She was describing technology that became more effective when enemies tried to counter it, a fundamental reversal of the electronic warfare arms race that had characterized military technology for decades. CIA Director Robert Hayes spoke for the first time during the briefing, his question carrying the weight of intelligence operations that depended on electronic superiority. "Ms. Rodriguez, what prevents our adversaries from developing similar capabilities? If analog technology provides such significant advantages, why haven't they already deployed it?" Elena had anticipated this concern and spent considerable time analyzing the strategic factors that had created the current opportunity. Director Hayes, our adversaries face the same institutional biases that initially prevented us from recognizing analog technology's potential. Military engineers worldwide have been trained to pursue increasingly sophisticated digital solutions. Suggesting that primitive technology could outperform advanced systems contradicts 40 years of professional development. She advanced to a slide showing organizational charts from various adversary technology programs. Additionally, analog expertise has been systematically eliminated from military engineering programs. Universities stopped teaching vacuum tube theory in the 1980s. Defense contractors discontinued analog research when digital processing became dominant. The knowledge base required to develop these systems effectively has been preserved in very few places. Quote, General Foster was studying intelligence reports that showed adversary responses to American analog deployments. Are you saying that our enemies can't counter this technology because they've forgotten how it works? More precisely, General, they've never encountered it in operational contexts, Elena replied. Modern electronic warfare training is based on digital threats. Military academies teach countermeasures against computer-controlled systems. Field exercises simulate attacks using contemporary technology. Analog warfare operates outside the paradigms that define current military education. Elena moved to her concluding slides, which outlined the strategic recommendations that had emerged from 6 months of successful operations. The key insight from Project Retrograde is that sustainable military advantage often comes from approaches that adversaries don't expect, rather than technologies they can't match. We've created a capability that succeeds not because it's more advanced than enemy systems, but because it's fundamentally different from anything they're prepared to counter. Secretary Morrison was already thinking about resource allocation decisions that would determine how Elena's technology was integrated into broader defense strategy. Ms. Rodriguez, what would full-scale deployment require in terms of personnel, training, and infrastructure? Elena had prepared comprehensive implementation plans that addressed every aspect of operational deployment. Madam Secretary, analog technology requires specialized knowledge, but that knowledge can be acquired more rapidly than expertise in advanced digital systems. We've developed training programs that can produce competent operators in 6 weeks rather than the 2 years required for conventional electronic warfare specialists. She displayed training schedules that showed how military personnel could transition from traditional electronic warfare to analog capabilities. The infrastructure requirements are minimal compared to digital systems. Analog equipment operates without the cooling systems, power conditioning, and electromagnetic shielding that characterize modern military electronics. Deployment costs are typically 1/10 of equivalent digital capabilities. General Foster was considering operational implications that extended beyond immediate electronic warfare applications. Ms. Rodriguez, could this approach be applied to other military technologies? Are there other areas where analog principles might provide similar advantages? Elena felt the excitement that came from recognizing opportunities that others had missed. General, we've already identified applications in navigation systems, communications networks, and sensor technologies. Any military capability that currently depends on digital processing could potentially benefit from analog alternatives or hybrid architectures. Admiral Chen was thinking about fleet applications where Elena's technology could provide decisive advantages in contested environments. Ms. Rodriguez, what timeline are we looking at for operational deployment across major commands? Admiral, initial capabilities could be deployed within 90 days, Elena replied. Full integration with existing systems would take approximately 18 months, but interim capabilities could provide immediate operational advantages. The briefing concluded with Elena receiving authorization to expand Project Retrograde into a full-scale development program with classification levels that reflected its strategic importance. But as military leaders filed out of the conference room, Elena realized that the most significant change wasn't in her professional status or the resources now available for her research. She had proven that innovation often required abandoning sophisticated approaches in favor of fundamental ones, that the most effective solutions sometimes came from directions that experts never considered. More importantly, she had demonstrated that individual insight could influence national security strategy when it was based on sound principles and supported by empirical evidence. Elena's grandfather had taught her that the most important battles were often won by those who understood that victory sometimes required fighting by rules that everyone else had forgotten. Her father had shown her that the most elegant solutions often appeared simple only because they were based on principles so fundamental that people stopped paying attention to them. Today, Elena understood that those lessons were more relevant than ever in an age where technological complexity had become so dominant that people had forgotten the power of simplicity. She had transformed obsolete equipment into strategic capability not by making it more sophisticated, but by applying it in ways that sophisticated enemies couldn't anticipate. As Elena packed her presentation materials, she thought about the young contractors and military engineers who would inherit the program she had developed. They would face adversaries who understood that electronic warfare had been fundamentally transformed, who would develop countermeasures against analog technology just as they had against digital systems. But Elena had also learned that sustainable advantage came not from any particular technology, but from the willingness to question fundamental assumptions, to approach familiar problems from unfamiliar directions, to remember that innovation often required forgetting what everyone knew was impossible. 6 months ago, Elena Rodriguez had been an invisible contractor arranging museum pieces in the corner of a briefing room. Today, she was the architect of strategic capabilities that had redefined electronic warfare doctrine. The transformation hadn't come from developing more advanced technology, but from recognizing that sometimes the most powerful innovations were hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the insight to see them and the courage to prove that conventional wisdom was wrong. The Pentagon's corridors buzzed with conversations about implications that extended far beyond Elena's immediate work. Military planners were reconsidering fundamental assumptions about technological superiority. Defense contractors were examining their own research programs for overlooked opportunities. Intelligence analysts were reassessing adversary capabilities based on principles that predated the digital revolution. But Elena understood that the most important lesson from Project Retrograde wasn't about technology at all. It was about the power of individual insight to influence institutions, the possibility that one person with the right knowledge and sufficient determination could change how the world's most sophisticated organizations approach their most critical challenges. As she walked through hallways where decisions affecting global security were made daily, Elena carried with her the knowledge that innovation was always possible for those willing to look beyond conventional approaches, to question established assumptions, to remember that sometimes the future belonged to those who understood the past well enough to apply it in ways that no one else had considered. The cardboard boxes that had once contained obsolete equipment now held prototypes of systems that would influence military strategy for decades. But more importantly, they represented proof that individual vision could overcome institutional inertia, that fundamental breakthroughs often came from directions that experts never anticipated, and that the most powerful technologies were sometimes the ones that everyone had forgotten existed. 3 weeks after the Pentagon briefing, Elena found herself in a converted warehouse facility in Nevada, where the first full-scale analog warfare manufacturing plant was taking shape. The irony wasn't lost on her. The most advanced military technology program in development was being built using machine tools that belonged in industrial museums and techniques that predated the space program. Master Sergeant Rachel Thompson, recently assigned as Elena's military liaison, supervised teams of technicians who were learning to hand-wind electromagnetic coils according to specifications that hadn't been used since the Truman administration. "Ma'am, the production teams are asking about quality control standards. These components don't have the precision tolerances we're accustomed to in modern electronics." Elena smiled, remembering similar conversations with her grandfather about the differences between analog and digital engineering philosophy. "Sergeant Thompson, analog systems are designed to work with component variations that would crash digital circuits. The key is understanding which tolerances matter and which ones don't." She walked along production lines where vacuum tubes were being tested, using equipment that looked like it belonged in a 1950s television repair shop. In digital systems, a component either works perfectly or fails completely. But analog components can operate across wide ranges of performance variation. That flexibility is actually an advantage in military environments where equipment needs to function under extreme conditions. The manufacturing facility represented a revolution in defense procurement philosophy. Traditional military electronics required cleanroom environments, rare earth elements sourced from potentially hostile nations, and manufacturing processes that could take months to complete individual units. Elena's analog systems were being assembled in converted automotive plants, using materials available from domestic suppliers and techniques that could be learned by experienced mechanics in a matter of weeks. Dr. James Morrison, recently recruited from a university engineering program that still taught vacuum tube theory, was overseeing quality assurance procedures that seemed almost primitive compared to modern semiconductor manufacturing. "Ms. Rodriguez, these production methods remind me of aircraft manufacturing during World War II. High volume, standardized processes, materials that can be sourced domestically without strategic vulnerability." Elena nodded approvingly. "Dr. Morrison, that comparison is more accurate than you realize. were essentially reinventing the industrial philosophy that allowed America to outproduce its enemies during the last global conflict. The difference is that we're applying those principles to electronic warfare instead of aircraft production. The facility's testing laboratory occupied a building that had previously housed agricultural equipment manufacturing. Banks of analog oscilloscopes displayed waveforms that would have been familiar to engineers from the early Cold War era, but the applications were cutting-edge military technology. Elena's team was developing portable systems that could disable satellite communications, neutralize drone swarms, and disrupt enemy command networks using principles from Heinrich Hertz's original electromagnetic experiments. Lieutenant Colonel David Park, assigned as Project Security Officer, was documenting procedures that would allow rapid expansion of analog warfare capabilities across multiple military commands. Ms. Rodriguez, the Joint Chiefs want to understand scalability timelines. How quickly could we establish similar manufacturing capabilities at other locations? Elena consulted production schedules that showed manufacturing timelines that seemed almost impossible to defense contractors accustomed to multi-year development cycles. Colonel Park, we could establish operational production at 3 additional sites within 6 months. The equipment required is relatively simple, and the techniques can be taught using existing industrial infrastructure. She gestured toward assembly lines where technicians were building systems that cost less than luxury automobiles, but could neutralize weapons platforms worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The limiting factor isn't manufacturing capacity, it's training qualified personnel. We need engineers who understand electromagnetic theory and technicians who can work with analog circuits. Those skills have become rare in an industry dominated by digital technology. Elena's office in the facility overlooked production floors where the future of electronic warfare was being assembled using tools that looked like antiques. Her desk contained proposals for applications that extended far beyond the original electronic warfare mission. Defense contractors who had initially dismissed her work were now requesting collaboration on projects that could revolutionize everything from missile guidance systems to satellite communications. The transformation in Elena's professional status was remarkable, but she understood that sustainable innovation required building institutions that could continue developing analog technology long after her direct involvement ended. The Nevada facility was designed not just to manufacture current systems, but to train the next generation of engineers who would push analog warfare capabilities in directions that even Elena hadn't yet imagined. Dr. Susan Williams, recently appointed as the facility's research director, was developing educational programs that would restore analog engineering knowledge that had been systematically eliminated from university curricula over the past 3 decades. Elena, we're essentially reconstructing an entire engineering discipline that was abandoned when the industry shifted to digital technology. The learning curve is steep, but the applications are virtually unlimited. Elena reviewed research proposals that explored analog solutions for problems that digital technology had never adequately addressed. Navigation systems that couldn't be jammed or spoofed. Communication networks that remained operational after electromagnetic pulse events. Sensor technologies that could detect stealth aircraft using principles that predated radar-absorbing materials. The international implications of Elena's work were becoming increasingly significant. Allied nations were requesting access to analog warfare technology that could provide decisive advantages against adversaries who had invested heavily in digital countermeasures. Enemy intelligence services were desperately trying to understand how American electronic warfare capabilities had suddenly become immune to their most sophisticated jamming systems. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Kiddo, saw your picture in the newspaper today. Your mom would be proud. Call when you get a chance." She smiled, thinking about how her parents would react to learning that their daughter's hobby projects had become classified national security programs. The evening news had carried carefully sanitized reports about breakthrough developments in American electronic warfare capabilities, without revealing any technical details that could compromise operational security. But Elena understood that her work represented something more significant than military technology advancement. She had proven that individual innovation could influence strategic capabilities when it was based on sound principles and persistent effort. 1 year after her first demonstration at Holloman, Elena received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during her days as an invisible contractor. The National Academy of Engineering was presenting her with a Charles Stark Draper Prize, recognizing contributions to engineering that had significantly impacted society. The ceremony would take place at the Kennedy Center, with an audience including Nobel laureates, technology leaders, and government officials whose decisions shaped American innovation policy. Elena stood in her hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, holding the acceptance speech she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. The words needed to capture not just her technical achievements, but the broader lesson about innovation that her work represented. She thought about the journey from her grandfather's basement workshop to this moment of national recognition, understanding that the real story wasn't about analog technology, but about the power of unconventional thinking to solve contemporary problems. The ceremony hall buzzed with conversations between people whose collective work had defined American technological leadership for generations. Dr. Robert Goddard III, descendant of the rocket pioneer, was discussing space exploration with entrepreneurs who'd built companies worth billions. MIT professors compared notes with Silicon Valley innovators who'd transformed global communications. Elena found herself in conversations with people whose names appeared in engineering textbooks, but who were genuinely curious about her approach to electronic warfare. Dr. Angela Martinez, a materials scientist who'd revolutionized solar panel technology, approached Elena with obvious fascination. Ms. Rodriguez, I've been following your work since the first reports appeared in classified journals. What strikes me is how you've demonstrated that breakthrough innovation can come from any direction, not just from pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Elena appreciated the insight from someone who understood the challenges of translating theoretical knowledge into practical applications. Dr. Martinez, I think the key insight is that innovation often requires stepping outside conventional approaches entirely. We spend so much energy trying to make existing technologies better that we sometimes miss opportunities to use different technologies entirely. The conversation attracted other attendees who were intrigued by Elena's perspective on innovation philosophy. Professor David Chen from Stanford was particularly interested in how analog principles might apply to other fields where digital solutions had become dominant. Ms. Rodriguez, are there other areas where forgotten technologies might provide contemporary advantages? What other assumptions should we be questioning? Elena had been thinking about exactly that question since her success with electronic warfare had opened doors to opportunities she'd never imagined. Professor Chen, I think we've become so focused on computational solutions that we've forgotten the power of physical phenomena. Mechanical systems, chemical processes, optical principles that don't require digital processing might offer solutions to problems we're trying to solve with increasingly complex algorithms. The discussion continued throughout the reception, with Elena finding herself at the center of conversations about innovation methodology that extended far beyond military applications. Biomedical researchers were curious about analog approaches to medical device design. Environmental engineers wondered whether mechanical solutions might address problems that electronic systems couldn't solve reliably. Energy specialists were intrigued by possibilities for power generation and distribution that didn't depend on sophisticated control systems. Dr. Rachel Thompson, a biochemist who developed breakthrough cancer treatments, posed a question that captured the broader implications of Elena's work. Ms. Rodriguez, you've shown that individual insight can challenge institutional assumptions and create breakthrough capabilities. But how do we encourage more people to think this way? How do we create environments where unconventional approaches are valued rather than dismissed? Elena recognized the question as fundamental to sustaining innovation beyond her specific contributions. Dr. Thompson, I think it starts with education that emphasizes problem-solving methodology rather than just technical knowledge. My grandfather taught me to understand electromagnetic principles, but more importantly, he taught me to question why things worked the way they did, and whether they had to work that way. She gestured toward the gathering of distinguished engineers and scientists around them. Everyone in this room has achieved remarkable things by mastering established fields, but breakthrough innovation often comes from people who are willing to venture outside their expertise, to apply knowledge from one field to problems in completely different areas. The formal ceremony began with Elena taking her place among recipients whose work had influenced everything from internet infrastructure to medical technology. As she listened to introductions describing her fellow honorees' achievements, Elena reflected on how different her path had been from the traditional routes to engineering recognition. Most of the other recipients had built their careers within established institutions, advancing through academic ranks or corporate hierarchies that provided resources and recognition for incremental improvements to existing technologies. Elena's breakthrough had come from working outside those systems entirely, from approaching problems that experts had already solved with solutions that experts had already dismissed. When Elena's name was called, She walked to the podium carrying notes that represented months of thinking about how to communicate the broader lessons from her experience. The audience included people whose decisions would influence American innovation policy for decades, and Elena understood that her words could affect how institutions approached unconventional ideas in the future. "Distinguished colleagues," Elena began, "I stand before you today not because I developed more sophisticated technology, but because I remembered simpler principles that everyone else had forgotten. My work with analog warfare succeeded not by advancing the state of the art, but by applying old art to new problems." She paused, looking out at faces that represented the pinnacle of American engineering achievement. The lesson from analog warfare isn't about electronics or military technology. It's about the power of approaching familiar problems from unfamiliar directions, about questioning assumptions that seem so fundamental we don't realize they're assumptions at all. Elena's speech continued for 15 minutes, weaving together technical details with broader observations about innovation methodology. She described how her grandfather's stories about Vietnam-era radar had influenced her understanding of electromagnetic principles. She explained how her father's automotive expertise had taught her to see beauty in mechanical solutions. She outlined how months of patient experimentation had revealed vulnerabilities that sophisticated analysis had missed. But Elena's most important message was about the democratic nature of innovation itself. "Breakthrough discoveries don't require advanced degrees or institutional resources," she said. "They require curiosity, persistence, and the willingness to explore directions that conventional wisdom considers irrelevant or obsolete." The standing ovation that followed Elena's speech lasted nearly 5 minutes, but she understood that the real measure of her impact wouldn't be applause. It would be whether her example encouraged other people to question established approaches, to explore unconventional solutions, to remember that innovation was always possible for those willing to think differently about familiar problems. As Elena accepted congratulations from fellow recipients and attendees, she thought about the young engineers and scientists who might be inspired by her story to pursue their own unconventional ideas. The analog warfare program would continue developing under new leadership, but Elena's greater contribution was demonstrating that individual insight could influence institutional capabilities when it was supported by sound principles and persistent effort. The evening concluded with Elena standing on the Kennedy Center balcony, looking out over Washington landmarks illuminated against the night sky. Somewhere in those buildings, decisions were being made about research priorities, defense strategies, and innovation policies that would shape American technological leadership for generations. Elena's work had proven that breakthrough capabilities could emerge from unexpected directions, that sustainable advantages often came from approaches that adversaries couldn't anticipate, and that the most powerful solutions sometimes required forgetting what everyone knew was impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.